Part 1, The Visitor. It was Christmas Eve, and the storm outside was relentless. The wind howled like a lost soul, rattling the old windows of the cabin I'd rented for the holidays. This was supposed to be my escape, a chance to get away from the chaos of city life, from people. No awkward family dinners, no cheery carolers at my door. Just peace. I'd chosen a remote spot deep in the woods. The rental listing had warned about unreliable cell service and the long, winding drive, but I didn't care. It was perfect. A cozy, two-bedroom cabin with a fireplace, stocked bookshelves, and a snow-covered forest as far as the eye could see. The first couple of days had been magical. I'd spent my time reading by the fire, sipping mulled wine, and watching snowflakes drift lazily past the windows. But by Christmas Eve, the storm had rolled in, heavy and unrelenting. The electricity flickered once, twice, then gave up entirely. By candlelight, the cabin took on a different personality. Shadows stretched long and sharp across the walls, flickering with the dancing flames. It felt alive, in a way that was almost unsettling. I brushed it off, blaming the isolation. Too much quiet can mess with your head. I was halfway through my second glass of wine when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. I froze. No one should be out here. My nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles away, and there was no way anyone would brave the storm just to pay me a visit. The knock came again, more insistent this time. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stood. The logical part of me screamed to ignore it. But curiosity, or maybe foolishness, drove me forward. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and moved to the door. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I turned the deadbolt slowly, the sound echoing in the silence, and cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. A figure stood there, barely visible in the swirling snow. They were hunched against the wind, wearing a long, dark coat. Their face was obscured by a hood, and something about the way they stood sent a shiver down my spine. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice louder this time. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they tilted their head slightly, as if studying me. Finally, a voice emerged, low, raspy, and strange. "I'm lost." It didn't feel right. Their tone was flat, emotionless, and they didn't shiver despite the biting cold. "How did you find this place?" I asked, gripping the edge of the door tighter. I saw the light. The light? The power had been out for over an hour. Something about their answer made my skin crawl, and I started to push the door closed. But before I could, they reached out, a hand pale as the snow, fingers too long, nails blackened at the tips. "Wait," they whispered. I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt. My hands were shaking as I backed away, my mind racing. Who, or what, had I just let onto my doorstep? The knocking returned, louder this time, relentless. "Please," the voice called, more urgent now. "It's so cold." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed the largest knife I could find from the kitchen and retreated to the living room. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The knocking stopped, replaced by a scratching sound. It was coming from the back of the house. My breath caught in my throat. There was no back door, just windows. I hadn't heard them move from the front. "Let me in." The voice was closer now, as if they were speaking right into my ear. I whipped around, flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but there was no one there. The room was empty, silent except for the roaring wind outside. Then, I saw it, a faint outline of a handprint on the frosted windowpane, long and skeletal, smeared as though it had dragged itself down the glass. And then, the lights came back on. For a moment, the sudden brightness was blinding. I blinked rapidly, scanning the room. Everything looked normal again, no handprint, no figure at the window. I could have convinced myself it was all in my head, a trick of the storm and the candlelight. But then I heard it. A single, soft creak from the floorboards upstairs. Someone, or something, was inside. Part 2, Unwanted Company. The creak came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable, a deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight on the old wooden floorboards. My stomach twisted as I stared at the ceiling, half expecting to see it buckle under the weight of whatever, or whoever, was up there. I didn't remember locking the bedroom door earlier, but I prayed I had. I clenched the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, willing myself to move. Just call for help, I thought. But the useless phone on the kitchen counter mocked me. No signal, no lifeline. I was on my own. The storm outside roared with renewed fury, rattling the cabin as I started up the narrow staircase. Each step creaked beneath me, and I cursed myself for choosing such an old, isolated place. Halfway up, I froze. Another sound drifted down, a faint hum, melodic and low, like a lullaby. It didn't make sense. Who would be singing in the middle of a storm, uninvited, inside my cabin? The flashlight shook in my grip as I pushed forward, one agonizing step at a time. The hum grew louder, more distinct, until I recognized the tune, Silent Night. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched before me like a dark tunnel, the flickering beam of my flashlight barely illuminating the door to the master bedroom at the end. The hum was coming from behind it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by fear. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to bolt back down the stairs and barricade myself in the living room. But I couldn't leave it alone, not knowing what was on the other side. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. My ears strained for any sound, a footstep, a breath, anything, but the storm outside seemed to swallow everything. I stepped closer, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned with each movement. When I reached the door, I hesitated, one hand hovering over the handle. My palm was slick with sweat, the cold metal beneath my fingers anchoring me to the moment. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, bed neatly made, curtains drawn, the small pile of books on the nightstand undisturbed. But the air felt wrong. It was heavy, oppressive, and carried a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. And then I saw it. On the bed, something lay under the covers, perfectly still. The shape was unmistakable, a person, lying on their back, their outline clear beneath the quilt. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping into the room, knife raised. "I'm armed. Get out of here." No response. I inched closer, flashlight trained on the bed. The shape didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. I reached out with the knife and hooked the edge of the quilt. With one sharp motion, I pulled it back. Nothing. The bed was empty. I stumbled backward, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My flashlight flickered wildly as I scrambled to pick it up, heart racing, mind spinning. That's when the closet door creaked open. It wasn't a loud sound, just the faintest whisper of wood on wood, but in the suffocating quiet of the room, it might as well have been a gunshot. The door didn't swing open all the way. It stopped halfway, leaving a sliver of darkness exposed. The humming started again. It was louder now, echoing as though coming from the depths of a long, dark tunnel. I backed out of the room, dragging the flashlight beam across the closet, the bed, the corners of the room. Nothing moved, but the air grew colder with every passing second, my breath now visible in thin white clouds. Just as I reached the hallway, the bedroom door slammed shut on its own, the force shaking the walls. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted down the stairs, my bare feet slipping on the worn wood, and nearly toppled into the living room. The candles I'd left burning earlier had gone out, leaving the room in utter darkness. The only light came from the fireplace, its flames unnaturally low, casting weak shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. And then I heard it again. Not the humming this time, but a voice, soft, crooning, and sickeningly sweet. "Why don't you let me in?" It was coming from the front door. The doorknob rattled, slow and deliberate, as though whoever, or whatever, was outside was testing the lock. My hands shook as I grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, clutching it tightly as I pressed my back against the far wall. My mind raced. What did they want? How had they gotten in earlier? "Please," the voice said, dripping with mock sincerity. "It's Christmas. No one should be alone on Christmas." The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the crackle of the fire. Then, from behind me, I heard the faintest whisper, so close it sent a chill crawling down my spine. "You didn't lock the window." Part 3, The Shadows in the Flames. I spun around, swinging the fire poker wildly, but struck nothing but empty air. The window behind me was shut, the latch firmly in place, and yet the voice, it had been so close, too real to dismiss as imagination. The cabin felt alive now, like it was breathing, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The voice from outside began again, still sugary sweet but laced with something darker, something taunting. "Oh, you're scared, aren't you? I would be too." I couldn't take my eyes off the window. The storm outside was a swirling chaos of snow, but I could swear I saw movement in the shadows. Then I heard it, the creak of footsteps coming from the back of the house again. I didn't stop to think this time. Clutching the fire poker, I darted into the kitchen and yanked open a drawer, grabbing a handful of mismatched knives. The weight of them in my hands offered some reassurance, but not much. I turned off the flashlight. The beam felt like a beacon, giving away my position. The faint glow of the fire was enough to navigate by, and if they, or it, was still inside, I didn't want to make it easy for them. The footsteps were louder now, deliberate, as if they wanted me to hear them. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "What do you want?" The reply came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I want you to open the door." The voice was wrong, layered, as if more than one person was speaking in unison. "Go away!" I screamed. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd scared them off. But then, from the direction of the living room, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. I crept toward the sound, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn and run. The tapping grew louder as I approached the fireplace, and then I saw it. The flames were no longer orange and yellow but a deep, unnatural blue, casting cold light across the room. In the center of the fire, something moved. It was a hand. Long and pale, with fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly far, the hand pressed against the inside of the glass fireplace screen. Its nails were blackened, the same as the ones I'd seen on the figure outside. The tapping was the sound of those nails rapping against the glass, slow and deliberate. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the knives. The hand pressed harder, as if testing the barrier, and the flames flared bright for an instant before dimming again. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand withdrew, vanishing into the blue flames. I backed away, my legs trembling. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself. "It's just the storm, the dark. I'm just seeing things." But deep down, I knew better. A new sound broke the silence, a low, guttural laugh, coming from everywhere at once. "Seeing things," the voice mocked. "Yes. But it's not the dark, little one." The laughter grew louder, reverberating through the cabin, making the walls tremble. I covered my ears, dropping one of the knives in the process. "Stop!" I screamed. The laughter cut off abruptly, leaving the cabin in eerie silence once more. And then, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. I turned, swinging the fire poker with all my strength. It connected with something solid, and I heard a sickening crunch. But when I looked, there was nothing there, just the empty room, the faint echo of the impact ringing in my ears. I didn't have time to process it, because the front door burst open with a deafening crash, the wind howling through the cabin like a living thing. Snow swirled inside, coating the floor, and in the doorway stood the figure from before, taller now, its hood still obscuring its face. I asked nicely, it said, its voice impossibly deep, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled back, my legs giving out as I hit the floor. The figure stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind it without anyone touching it. The air in the cabin grew colder, the fire sputtering until it was nothing but embers. What do you want?" I stammered, my breath forming icy clouds. The figure tilted its head, the gesture eerily familiar. "You invited me," it said simply. "No, I didn't." I shouted. "Oh, but you did," it said, stepping closer. "You opened the door. You let me in. And now." It crouched down, its face level with mine, though the hood remained an impenetrable shadow. I could feel its breath, icy, rancid, on my skin. "Now, you're mine." Part 4, Bound in the Dark. The words sent a bolt of terror through me, freezing me to the floor as the figure's shadow seemed to spread, swallowing the room. Its presence was suffocating, heavier than the air, pressing against my chest until I thought I might collapse. "I didn't invite you," I choked out, clutching the fire poker like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. "I didn't." The figure chuckled, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in my bones. "Oh, but you did. You cracked the door. You looked me in the eye. That's all it takes." Its words crawled under my skin, embedding themselves like splinters. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body refused to move, pinned by an invisible weight. The shadow spread further, swallowing the walls, the ceiling, until the entire room dissolved into darkness. Only the faint embers of the dying fire remained, casting a dim, flickering glow around the figure. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm outside. It leaned closer, the hood finally shifting enough to reveal something underneath. But it wasn't a face, not in the way you'd expect. Its skin was smooth and featureless, a pale canvas interrupted only by two hollow, gaping voids where eyes should have been. They weren't empty, though. Inside, something moved, shifting shapes, like shadows in a glass jar, writhing and stretching as if desperate to escape. "I am what waits," it said, its voice layered and alien. "What answers when the door is left open? You called for me, and now I'm here." "No," I muttered, shaking my head violently. "I didn't call for anything. You didn't have to. It's Christmas, after all. The season of giving." The thing tilted its head again, a grotesque parody of curiosity. "And I'm here to give you exactly what you need." The shadows around us began to shift, crawling closer, reaching out with tendrils of blackness. I scrambled backward, clutching at the knives scattered on the floor, but the darkness seemed alive, coiling around my legs, pulling me toward the figure. "I don't want anything." I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but it was like fighting quicksand. The figure's hollow gaze never wavered. "Oh, but you do. Everyone wants something. Loneliness brought you here, didn't it? You didn't want to be alone." "Not really." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I told myself this trip was about peace, about solitude. But the truth was harder to swallow. I'd run away, isolating myself because I couldn't face the hollowness in my chest. The figure seemed to sense the shift in my thoughts. It reached out, a hand pale and too long, fingers writhing like snakes. "Let me take it away," it whispered. "I'll fill the emptiness for you." The hand was inches from my face now, the shadows holding me in place, suffocating me. I could feel its cold radiating against my skin, hear the faint whispering from within the voids of its eyes. "Stop!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "Leave me alone." The figure hesitated, its hand pausing mid-reach. For a moment, the room seemed to tremble, the shadows wavering as if unsure. "You want me to leave?" it asked, its tone suddenly softer, almost gentle. "Yes," I shouted. "Yes, I want you to go." The figure tilted its head again, as if considering my words. Then it straightened, towering over me, its shadow stretching impossibly high. "Very well," it said. "But there's a price for everything, isn't there?" Before I could respond, the darkness surged forward, engulfing me completely. The cold was unbearable, cutting through me like shards of glass, and the whispers grew deafening, filling my mind with voices, familiar, unfamiliar, all speaking at once. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the darkness retreated. I gasped for air, collapsing onto the floor. The room was empty again, the fire burning bright, casting warm light across the cabin. But something was wrong. I stumbled to my feet, looking around frantically. The storm had stopped. The snow outside was still, the world eerily silent. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. Because when I looked into the window, I didn't see my reflection. I saw it. The pale, hollow-eyed thing stared back at me, its movements mirroring mine perfectly. I touched my face, and so did it. I opened my mouth to scream, and it grinned. Part 5, A Final Gift. The grin on its face, that monstrous, hollow-eyed version of me, stretched unnaturally wide. My reflection in the window felt more alive than I did, its movements fluid and deliberate while I stood paralyzed, my breath fogging the glass. "You think this is over?" it whispered, though its lips didn't move. "It's just beginning." I stumbled back from the window, clutching the fire poker with trembling hands. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, my mind racing for a way out. The cabin felt wrong, like I was standing in the middle of a living thing that was breathing, waiting. The room grew darker, the firelight dimming until only embers remained. The figure in the window stayed perfectly illuminated, its eyes gleaming with something far worse than malice, amusement. "Who are you?" I croaked, barely recognizing my own voice. Its grin widened. "You." I turned to run, but the shadows in the room had grown dense, thick as tar, blocking every path. My body felt heavy, each step dragging me deeper into the suffocating dark. "You called me," it said, its voice no longer confined to the reflection. It was everywhere, wrapping around me like cold fingers. "You are me." "No." I screamed, slamming the fire poker into the floor, the sharp clang echoing through the cabin. "You're lying." But as the sound faded, the walls began to groan, bending inward as if the cabin itself were collapsing. The shadows surged, swallowing the furniture, the walls, everything. Then, everything stopped. Silence. I blinked, and the cabin was gone. I was standing in a forest, surrounded by towering pines cloaked in snow. The storm had ceased, leaving the world eerily still. My breath hung in the air, a fragile mist, as I turned in a slow circle. "Hello." I called, my voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, cloaked in shadow. It wasn't the thing from the cabin. This one was smaller, familiar. It stepped closer, and my stomach churned as the details emerged. It was me. Not the hollow-eyed creature, but me as I had been just hours ago, disheveled, anxious, holding a flashlight and a knife. It looked terrified. It stumbled forward, snow crunching underfoot, its wide, frantic eyes meeting mine. "You have to help me," it shouted, its voice ragged with desperation. I froze, the fire poker slipping from my fingers. "What?" "You have to listen," it cut me off, reaching out. "It's a trick. It's still here. It never leaves." I stepped back, shaking my head. "No, no, this isn't real. You're not real." The other me grabbed my shoulders, its grip icy. "You have to wake up. You have to. Its voice was cut off by a sickening crunch as a hand burst through its chest from behind. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the cold, as it gasped and crumpled to the ground. Behind it stood the hollow-eyed figure, its pale face split into a grotesque grin. Its hand, slick with blood, dripped onto the snow as it turned its gaze to me. "This is the game," it said, its voice soft and sweet, mocking. "You run, you scream, you fight. But in the end, you always come back to me." I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the icy ground. "Stay away." It tilted its head, stepping closer. "Oh, but you've already stayed too long." The forest around me began to shift, the trees bending unnaturally, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. Faces formed in the bark, mouths stretching open in silent screams as the shadows grew darker, denser, crawling toward me. I turned and ran, my breath ragged, the snow grabbing at my ankles. The air grew colder with every step, freezing my lungs as the forest closed in around me. But no matter how far I ran, the cabin was always ahead of me. Its crooked silhouette loomed in the distance, firelight flickering in the windows like a heartbeat. And inside, I saw them. Not one, but dozens of figures, all identical to me, their faces twisted in terror, pounding on the windows, screaming silently for help. I stopped, my legs trembling, my vision swimming. Behind me, the voice whispered again, soft and mocking. "It's Christmas. A time for company. And now you're mine." I turned, swinging wildly with the fire poker, but the figure wasn't there. Instead, I saw myself standing in the distance, grinning back at me with hollow, endless eyes. And then I was inside the cabin again. Not as the one running, but as one of the figures behind the glass, screaming silently, endlessly, watching as another version of me staggered toward the door outside, clutching a flashlight and a knife. The knock came again. Soft, insistent. The new me reached for the handle. And I screamed louder, knowing they couldn't hear me. Knowing they would open it. Some doors were never meant to be opened. But once you do, it never stops. You'll always be running. You'll always end up back here. And there's no escape. Not ever,